Hello, I'm still reading through my book, Father of Faith, in the Footsteps of Abraham. And we're up to step 6, first bombshell. Isn't it just like God to come in with an, oh, by the way, there was something else I wanted to say. As if Abram didn't already have enough to cope with, then God dropped a bombshell. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah, and I will bless her and give her a son also of her. Genesis 17, verse 15. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah, and I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. What a statement. Where did that come from? What a world of significance in those few words. What a bombshell. These last few words that God had just said sent Abraham's mind reeling. What was God talking about? Sarah would have a child. God had already given him a child. He had Ishmael. He was content with this child whom he'd devoted his life to. Surely he was hearing wrong. Abram laughed. He was completely staggered at what God had shared. What was God thinking of? Abram wasn't worried anymore about not having an heir. Ishmael was here. He loved this boy. He was his flesh and blood. Was Ishmael not part of God's plan? Abraham may well have believed what God had promised him, but he certainly didn't know how God intended to bring it about, nor what he would encounter on his journey. The flesh always comes first. It's a spiritual and scriptural principle. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 46. Howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterward that which is spiritual. The first man is of the earth, earthy. The second man is of the Lord from heaven. Abraham had not been told before now that the child of promise would come via his barren wife. He was merely informed that his seed would come from his loins. He did not lack faith, nor did he run out of patience. He fulfilled God's plan to the very letter and was righteous in all he did, because everything he ever did was through faith in the promises of God. Ishmael had to be born first, for that's the way God in his wisdom works. God's day starts with the night, and the evening and the morning with the first day. Without a sinner, we couldn't have a saviour. No Adam, no Jesus, no old covenant, no new covenant, no heaven and earth, no new heaven and earth. We first have to have the Antichrist, then we have the Christ. The list could go on. One of the most astonishing passages in the whole Bible is to be found in Genesis 18, where God, accompanied by 2 angels, comes to pay Abram a personal visit. This would most certainly have taken place immediately after his circumcision. It's even possible that he was still recovering from his ordeal when God met him, for he was sitting in the door of his tent, shielding himself from the midday sun. Oh, to have an encounter like this. And this is the account from Genesis 18. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham in the plains of Mamre. And he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself toward the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favour in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, for thy servant. Let a little water, I pray thee, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and I'll fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do as you've said. And Abram hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And Abram ran ahead unto the herd, and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hastened to dress it. And he took butter and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. This is indeed staggering. God Almighty had knocked on Abram's door in person. He made a physical appearance. The Bible states in the Gospel of John and also the Epistle of John that no man has seen God at any time. But I think it must be God in his true spiritual body and glory that no man has seen, not in the physical disguise he wore here. For God most certainly is not a human being, even though we are made in his image. It's hard for my mind to get around the fact that God agreed to hang around while Abraham gave everyone their various tasks in order to prepare a meal for these very special guests. They didn't have fridges or freezers where they could defrost something quickly. Neither did they have food stores where they could buy food already prepared. They had to kill, then cook a calf, make and bake the bread. It must have taken hours to get this meal ready. But God waited graciously. Then he and the angels ate the food which was prepared, showing they appreciated all the trouble Abraham and his co-workers had gone to. And with a satisfied smile, he then asked, "Where's Sarah?" The fact that God called her Sarah proved beyond doubt his own identity, for nobody other than Abraham and God Almighty knew her as anything other than Sarai. And judging by her response to what God then said, I couldn't imagine that Abram had yet shared with her this particular part of God's conversation with him. He had initially laughed at this suggestion himself. Genesis 18 verse 10. And God said, "I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abram and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" I can just imagine the scene. Sarah is busy inside the tent, tending to all the needs of her husband and visitors, realizing that this encounter is way out of the ordinary for extremely important guests Abram's God and company have come to see him. She herself is getting a little flustered as Abram is acting completely out of character and can't relax. Because she was a woman, she was relegated to the kitchen to serve behind the scenes. But the tent curtains made very thin walls. You know, I could really feel for this woman. She had been truly humbled. Being the wife of the leader of the tribe, she had been able to hide the fact that she was barren. In her society, it was a terrible shame for a woman to be unable to bear children. It was bad enough if all you could produce were females, but not to produce at all was an awful stigma. She had hoped with all her heart that God would change his mind and open her womb. But after hoping year after year and then passing through her menopause, she came to the point where any hope that she would ever be a mother completely died within her. Hagar, her handmaid, had given Abraham a child, but as Hagar had nursed the child herself, she couldn't even attempt to compete with the special bond between mother and son. Ishmael would always be Hagar's. No, she had been found inadequate. All she had was her beauty, and in time even that would fail her. But what was this they were saying? She heard her name spoken. With ears straining, she must have been listening intently to all their conversation. Any wife would do the same. Well, I would anyway. But her ears would have pricked up at the mention of her name, and her reaction showed that this was indeed news to her. Such news that she couldn't take it in, and she laughed to herself incredulously. Put yourself in her shoes. How would you have reacted if God told you he would give you a baby when you were 89 years old, after waiting 25 years for it? Especially if it was your heart's desire when you were a young woman with all your life before you. Astonishment! Well, I know for certain that you wouldn't have reacted as Sarah did, for you wouldn't imagine you'd live as long as she did, but things were different back then. She might have been 89 years old then, but she still had many more years left in her and didn't die until she was 127. And did you know that Sarah is the only woman in the Bible to have her age recorded? This woman really made history and was meant to be taken notice of. Yes, God had to perform a miracle in her body, for at her age, even if fertile, it would have been impossible to have children after having gone through the menopause. But she believed and held on to the promise because she had heard the voice of God for herself, and anyone who has ever heard his voice knows that when God speaks, things happen. It was very much a man's world. God didn't speak directly with Sarah when sharing this news. He talked to Abram. The fact that Sarah was able to overhear was indeed a kindness to her. But all the time God was addressing her husband. Yet when God knew that she had laughed, and this wasn't done audibly for she laughed within herself, she must have clasped her hand over her mouth with her hands as her stomach laughed involuntarily. But God heard it and asked Abram why she laughed. Sarah obviously felt very guilty, knowing that she'd been found out, and spontaneously tries to justify herself. She came out from behind the tent wall. Genesis 18, verse 15. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, No, but you did laugh. The Lord looked directly at her and held her gaze. There was no condemnation, for she was the wife of his beloved friend. Indeed, she also was his friend. Abram and Sarah were one flesh. He spoke to her for the first time, and I'm absolutely certain that hearing that voice filled her with all the faith she needed to carry on believing for however long it took. Hebrews 11, verse 11. Through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. God was putting Sarah on the map. When he changed her name, she became a princess, for that is what Sarah meant. He was now her God. She had heard his voice for herself. The voice of the Lord is powerful. Psalm 21, it says this, Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The glory of God thundered. The Lord is upon many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yea, the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes them also to skip like a calf. Lebanon and Syrian like a young unicorn. The voice of the Lord divides the flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the hinds to calve and discovers the forests, and in his temple does everyone speak of his glory. The Lord sits upon the flood. Yea, the Lord sits king forever. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace.